You can go to the next slide. As always, we want to thank the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. If this is your first time joining us, we are Philanthropy Together, who coordinates this series. We're on a mission to diversify and democratize philanthropy through the power of giving circles. And we could not do this series without the support of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. So thank you to them. Next slide. Okay, so just some general housekeeping for everybody to know. Closed captioning is going to be available. All you're going to have to do, let me make sure it is enabled. All you have to do is just make sure that you click that little box with the CC at the bottom of your page. Anytime you see a little swirl in the chat, that's me messaging y'all. It will be links, it will be cheering you on in the comments, all of that great stuff. As a housekeeping reminder, if your microphone is not turned off, please make sure it's turned off just so that way there are no distractions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And if Seiji doesn't see them during the presentation, I can always bring them up at the end. We love seeing all of your faces, so please, join with the camera if you can, but if you're not comfortable, that's okay. Feel free to turn it off, whatever you need to engage. And we know many of you all are still calling in from home, so your kids, creatures, pod, and housemates are welcome. I have a dog sitting behind me that I'm praying does not bark in the meantime. And then always have something to take notes and process your thoughts. And just so you know, the session should be recorded. So if you want, you can turn off your camera and change your name if that is an issue for you. Next slide, please. All right, and then we invite you all today to listen deeply, make sure that you're staying engaged, whatever that means for you. Embrace discomfort, notice tension, ask yourself why you might be feeling discomfort or tension should any of that arise. Don't be afraid to take risks. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. These systems of oppression weren't built in a day and they're not going to be dismantled in one. And then I also would remind you all to hold each other with compassion. We know that social justice work is in fact a practice. And as part of that practice, you are going to make mistakes. I am going to make mistakes. What matters is that we take any feedback that we're getting and move from there. And with that, I'm going to ask for the next slide. And so finally, I am so excited to introduce Seiji. He is a member of the Social Justice Giving Circle Project. He also is a member of RAD Fund. He has 20 plus years of experience in quantitative and qualitative public opinion research. And he currently is a vice president of David Binder Research. I've worked with him closely on the Social Justice Project. He is amazing, intelligent, and just a phenomenal researcher. And I'm so excited to have him here today to talk more about the Social Justice Giving Project's work. And so with that, Seiji, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. And thank you all very much for joining. I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about us and the Social Justice Giving Circle Project, and then spend most of our time here today sharing some research that we have done. And as Kelsey mentioned, kind of by trade, I do public opinion research. So that is kind of survey research, as well as different types of qualitative research, focus groups, in-depth interviews, ethnographies, that type of thing. And then I also, as Kelsey mentioned, am a member of a giving circle. And so it's kind of an exciting meeting of these two worlds for me, that we got to do some research on issues related to giving circles that I care quite a bit about. So after we kind of go through the research and some of its implications, we'll open it up for Q&A. I'm hoping to allow a good chunk of time for Q&A at the end. So I probably won't see questions in the chat. So we will have time to address those at the end. So kind of quickly on the who we are. So 4 of us, Joelle, Mario, Ligia, and myself, who have been kind of working together, formally started in 2020. This project called the Social Justice Giving Circle Project. And really kind of we're looking for a way for some of us who had kind of had backgrounds in social justice movements and were kind of new to the world of giving circles and philanthropy. And then Mario and Joelle had a little bit of kind of more experience in philanthropy, kind of trying to understand like what it would mean for a giving circle to live up to social justice values. And kind of so started this project to support giving circles and their members and individuals to try to kind of connect more deeply with movements. We've conducted 2 phases of research now. In 2021, we did research with giving circles themselves. And then in 2022, we kind of did research with folks in social justice movements. And then the next phase, which Kelsey is helping us with, is kind of taking the results of that research, developing it into a curriculum, and then running a pilot project for a group of folks to kind of benefit more directly from that research. But today I'm going to kind of spend time sharing that research with you, trying to kind of talk about some of the things that we learned. So starting with phase 1, so the kind of animating question for us here was, how do Giving Circle members engage social justice movements? I think for kind of a lot of us who had been in movements and kind of were new to the philanthropy space, the question that was kind of animating this research is, how are giving circles approaching social justice movements? What does it mean to kind of be a social justice giving circle? What are we doing as social justice giving circles? What do we wish we were doing that we don't know how to? And so we kind of explored a number of those questions. I'm just going to kind of share a couple of the kind of key insights from that. I think Kelsey can kind of share a little bit more of the information there. And then if folks have specific questions, happy to touch on it in the Q&A. But the kind of key takeaways, the 2 kind of pairs of facts that I'm going to share. One is that kind of when we did this survey, 95% of folks said that their social justice giving circle, that their giving circle was kind of described as, they would describe as a social justice giving circle at least slightly well. So these are kind of folks who think of their giving circles as living up to social justice values, but only 15% said they had heard quite a bit about social justice best practices. So kind of operating in this space where folks are interested in social justice and trying to kind of align themselves with those values, but just kind of not hearing a lot about what that means in the social justice space, or in the giving circle space rather. One of the other things that we did is that we asked about a bunch of different types of practices that giving circles can do. And we asked kind of both like, how often do you do these things and how interested are you? And what we were looking for is the things where there was a lot of interest and not a lot of practice. And the number one thing, the kind of biggest gap that we saw of the things that we tested was building relationships with social justice leaders. 63% of those we talked to said they were interested in that. Only 22% said that they do it consistently. So that was kind of one of the things that informed our wave 2 as we kind of approached that, was kind of this desire to build these relationships, to engage more deeply and directly. And we wanted to kind of understand as we went into the next phase what that meant from the movement side. But our kind of key learning here coming out of the first phase of research was just that giving circle members and are people who care about social justice, especially kind of those who align themselves with these social justice giving circles. They're often kind of connected to the world of social justice. But when it comes to giving circles, they just kind of don't feel like they are experts. To put it another way, they kind of have a clear idea about what it means to live up to social justice values as a voter or as a consumer or as a citizen, but as a giving circle member or as a donor, it kind of raises new questions that they don't have as much kind of information or expertise on. And I should say this was, kind of conducted in 2021. I think that there's been kind of a lot of development, especially some of the stuff that you all have kind of been a part of and that Philanthropy Together has been working on, that hopefully is kind of better equipped folks with some of these tools. But that's kind of the space that we were kind of interested in exploring. I will kind of say that in addition to kind of, being a member of this project and a researcher, I am a member of a giving circle. It's called Rad Fund. You can kind of see our little tagline there. And I share this to kind of not to kind of say that I have all the answers about what it means to be a social justice giving circle, but quite the opposite, to say that we have grappled with a lot of these questions, and I understand very personally how difficult and complicated and nuanced they are. And so, what I'm going to be sharing is the kind of results of research and its implications in the abstract. But I'm very cognizant that in real life, when that kind of is put into practice, it often kind of leaves kind of challenging dilemmas where it feels like there's two different options that are living up to social justice values in different ways, which happy to kind of talk more about that in the Q&A if folks are interested. Okay, getting into kind of the meat of the research. So this is phase 2. How do social justice movements want to be engaged? So our kind of operating question going into this is, okay, giving circles have this interest in being more connected to social justice movements and having kind of stronger relationships with the leaders. But what do the movements want? What is helpful to them? Is it valuable to have folks who are kind of approaching them and engaging them? A lot of the I think a lot of us had kind of heard some anecdotal stories, especially after the election of Trump, of huge influx of volunteers in some organizations, especially in movement spaces, being kind of overwhelmed by folks who wanted to help, but didn't necessarily have the tools. And sometimes it felt like it could be too much. So we kind of wanted to go into this research with an open mind and kind of understand, is it helpful? Is there kind of a path to engagement here? Our methodology here, just kind of briefly, so this was conducted in March to May of this year. And we wanted to talk to people who work or have worked in social justice movements. And we focused in particular on folks who had some engagement with people outside of movements. So we were looking at kind of people who had a sense of kind of what it could be like to engage with folks who are not kind of full-time working in social justice movements. Obviously, like a lot of the terms that I'm using, like social justice movements, are subject to different definitions. And so we kind of really relied on participants' own definitions for the most part in kind of describing themselves and their work. A couple things about qualitative research, just for folks who may not have kind of a lot of exposure or experience with it. It's a snapshot in time. So these are conversations that took place in spring of this year. These are, I'm going to kind of share the attitudes and ideas that were expressed in that research. If we do our job in 5 years, 10 years, the attitudes that people will have shifted. So this isn't to say that these are inevitable attitudes, but just kind of where folks are at today. The participation in the research was confidential, so I'm not going to kind of share any of the names or identifying information about the participants, but suffice it to say that there was kind of a really diverse set. We kind of found folks from a diverse set of backgrounds, both geographically, demographically, as well as occupationally. So kind of looking from folks from all different parts of the movement. Kelsey helped an enormous amount with that piece as well. And so we were able to get kind of a lot of different voices included. And that means that the results are not a monolith. I mean, you're going to hear me kind of talk about what the research said, but largely this is kind of talking about themes that came up, things that we kind of heard again and again. Does not mean that everybody in social justice movement holds a particular idea or belief. This part of, so this is kind of phase 2 of the research. We further broke it down into wave 1 and wave 2, and just to kind of take you a little bit through our process so you can kind of understand how we got where we were going. The first wave was kind of exploratory interviews, and this was really just kind of giving folks in movements an opportunity to talk about their needs and wants. What are they looking for when they think about kind of folks outside of movements, engaging with them, what is helpful, what is not helpful, and then in particular, with some context about what giving circles are, how can they be of service, how can they be helpful? And then out of those conversations, we came up with a couple of different models, a couple of different ideas of some of the themes that folks were articulating about how giving circles could be helpful. And then in phase 2, we conducted research with groups of people where we kind of stress test those ideas, where we had a conversation about particular models and talked about kind of what the benefits and limitations of each and which were most promising and how they could best be executed. So the threshold question that we kind of began with, do social justice movements want to be engaged by people who are not working for those movements? And the overwhelming answer, a lot of what we did, there was a diversity of opinions. This was a question where there really kind of was unanimity, is that there was a strong desire for engagement. Folks kind of again and again were telling us how they wanted more people to be involved, how they needed more people to be involved. I'm going to kind of share these are kind of some of the verbatims of what folks said in their own words. I'm mostly not going to read these verbatims, these quotes, when as I share them, but kind of we'll just put them on the screen so you can kind of get a sense of how the participants talked about some of their own answers. But there was a very strong sense that at all costs, whatever the implementation, that we need more people, that movements they're built on people, and that more people means growth, means mass movements, means change, and that's kind of our path to reaching the social justice goals that we strive to. There definitely were concerns. I don't want to kind of minimize those concerns. There certainly were kind of some ideas and reservations expressed, but nobody kind of expressed their reservations to the point that further engagement was not worth pursuing. Okay, so if we pass the threshold question, then our kind of driving question was, how should Giving Circles approach this? How should Giving Circles engage social justice movements? And I'm gonna kind of break this down into a few guiding questions. And kind of we'll kind of talk through each of these, and then we'll move into Q&A. So how is the fit? How are we willing to show up, we as Giving Circles? How are we willing to learn? And how are we willing to give up power? So first, kind of the fit. How is the fit of your Giving Circle, of your collective, and a part of the social justice movement, a movement organization, a particular group? And this kind of really broke into these two groups of finding groups that fit you and finding the members that fit the groups. And so finding groups that fit you does not necessarily mean finding groups that reflect the demographics or racial groups of your members, although that certainly can be part of it. But really finding organizations that want to engage, that have the interest and the capacity to engage. And so that could be a group that has members that look like you. It could be a group that does not. But as with all of these things, we'll kind of say again and again that when we get guidance and ideas from these movement organizations, it's really valuable input. And when folks say that they want to engage, that those are boundaries that we really want to respect. The other side of kind of finding groups that fit you is finding the members that fit groups. So if it's an organization that is mostly Spanish-speaking home care workers, and you have, one or two members who are Spanish-speaking, those probably are good members to kind of start to build those relationships. So kind of thinking about kind of who within the group is the best fit, but also kind of which groups are kind of most open and interested in building those relationships. Here's kind of some of the verbatims that we're talking about, talking kind of in their own words about kind of these ideas. You can kind of see this phrase show up. That is kind of language that a lot of the folks in the movements use again and again. How do people show up? We need them to show up this way. I'm going to kind of use it to the point of making it trite, but it is kind of a phrase that came up again and again. All right, the second animating question, how are we willing to show up? So this was kind of the bulk of our conversation was really about the movement folks saying that it really depends on how the giving circles or the people in giving circles are willing to show up. And you can kind of see, how simplistic my headlines are here, do your best and show up more. But there's really kind of a lot within that. And so let me kind of take them one at a time. Do your best, not kind of, I don't mean to minimize it. I'm not saying just do your best, but really kind of trying to show up as your best self, doing your best as a giving circle, as an individual. You can see the kind of first bullet there, strive to be engaged, humble, reliable, and loving. These adjectives are not chosen on accident. These 4 adjectives kind of are the main themes that came up again and again. And for me, kind of in our Rad Fund work, like this was kind of one of my takeaways, is using these 4 as a checklist. Are we being engaged? Are we being humble? Are we being reliable and loving? I've talked a little bit about engaged, but one of the conversations that we had was these kind of 2 models, one of like a super donor model that was primarily about just like how much money can we channel to these groups, and one that was about kind of a more engaged model of like doing more, going beyond money. And one of the things that was interesting to me is how much folks wanted to go beyond money, not just because it added kind of additional inputs, additional contributions, but because they felt that that was the better way to build a relationship. That when it is just money, it becomes easier to walk away from, more transactional. But when it is kind of goes beyond money, that it becomes a more complex, nuanced relationship and kind of gets away from exclusively the kind of grantor, grantee, or donor recipient type of relationship. We'll talk a little bit more about reliability. Humility kind of came up, decentering oneself is a concept that we heard a lot about. With all of these things, I'll kind of say this a few different times, but participants in movements were really emphatic that when they talked about kind of what their ideal partner, their ideal supporter, their ideal ally would look like, they never wanted it to be exclusive. They never wanted to say that if you can't live up to all these things, then go away. They were kind of saying like, this would be best, but we understand that not everybody can do all of these things all of the time. And they kind of, this idea of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good is kind of also captured in do your best. The second, kind of this idea of show up more, that donations are the first step. This is kind of what I was talking about, kind of going beyond the donor relationship. One of the participants kind of talked about this as approaching the groups and the movement and kind of the community's goals and challenges as trying to kind of see those as their own. So instead of it being, I'm going to give money for them to solve the problems, it's I am kind of part of this and I see the problems and, oh, somebody needs a ride or somebody needs childcare while they go to the picket line, and kind of being present and engaged in that way kind of allows the movement to build. I'm going to share kind of a few of the different ideas. I know there's kind of a lot here and we will share this deck afterwards. So don't have to kind of read all of it, but you can kind of see a lot of the ideas here about going beyond the dollar, doing the dollar and, but also kind of the different ways of showing up. Just 2 more guiding questions and then we'll get to Q&A. The next one was kind of how are we willing to learn? And a lot of the folks in movement had the concern that some of the kind of really needed changes in the language that we use, in how we approach movement spaces, that has made it kind of feel safer for different types of folks to kind of be involved and be centered in movement spaces, also could be alienating for folks who are not familiar with the language or are worried that they're going to get language wrong or don't understand every issue and every intricacy. And so one of the things they talked about was, this idea of kind of learning to navigate movement spaces, like learning how to be comfortable in different either organization spaces or social justice spaces. And some of the ways that Giving Circle members can do that. So some of them kind of offer trainings, and so kind of completing and pursuing that type of trainings. But there was also kind of this idea of do the work, that if you're able to kind of do some of that work before you show up in the space, that allows you to be a better ally when you are in the space. Because instead of kind of spending the time in the space educating yourself, you're able to kind of have some familiarity before entering it. But they also kind of were emphatic that should not be dispositive, that they didn't want folks to be uncomfortable entering the space. And so they really kind of were encouraging of folks to also be able to kind of ask about concepts, either language or issues or policies that they're not familiar with, but also be able and willing to ask where to learn, to be able to kind of be the humble student and ask like, oh, that's a phrase that I am not familiar with. Can you point me to any resources where I could learn better? Understand it, so that we're not kind of gearing social justice spaces to donors or to Giving Circle members, but kind of using them as an opportunity for folks to learn. And you can see kind of a couple of the quotes that we had here, talking about kind of what it means to be an ally, what it means to kind of be in solidarity. I really love this quote on the right, kind of giving people an opportunity to fail, to ask the wrong questions, but in doing so to gradually radicalize. And then the last question, how are we willing to give up power? So you can kind of see these like high concept headlines: build structured accountability, don't keep relationships, embrace longevity. I kind of will articulate them in terms of what we need to let go of as Giving Circles. So the first one here is expertise. A lot of us are very used to kind of doing the work and then becoming experts and then implementing that expertise. And this is a space where we're just never going to be the foremost expert. What social justice movements need is always going to be better articulated by the folks who are doing social justice work. And so when we enter those spaces, when we build that relationship, it's an opportunity for us to kind of ask for feedback, ask for ideas, and then really kind of let that feedback drive our plans for change. The second, kind of not gatekeeping relationships, it's a nuanced one, because I think building the relationships with folks in movements, with movement organizations, is so important to growing these movements. It's so important to kind of entirely of what we are talking about here, but we never want our relationships to be at the expense of others. So particularly with Giving Circles, this is one that I think takes a lot of work, that we frankly have kind of struggled with, of having, when you have a kind of Giving Circle member who kind of takes responsibility for building a relationship with the head of an organization or somebody else in the organization, how do you make sure that that relationship does not then kind of exclude the rest of the Giving Circle? So kind of put another way, if the Giving Circle and kind of its surrounding folks is its own network, how do we make sure that that whole network is part of the social justice movement and not just the person who kind of holds that relationship? Part of it is kind of, as we say here, kind of encouraging members to build directly with organizations. You can kind of have one primary relationship, but allow other relationships to flourish. And then this kind of last point is one that came up again and again: the importance of, as you build relationships with organizations or build relationships with parts of social justice movements, is highlighting those folks to your network, to other donors, to other folks that you know. One person put this as essentially donate your network. That another thing that you can do besides donating money, time, expertise, is donating the relationships that you have, and letting go of your kind of ownership of those relationships. This is kind of not a sexy item, embrace longevity. But it is one that kind of came up and again. And I think for a lot of us who are kind of trying to engage with social justice movements, it's very tempting and easy to kind of do it on our terms when it is convenient. And one theme that we heard again and again is how important long-lasting relationships are. So talks about multi-year grants here, but folks talked about this in many, many ways. And I'll kind of take you to the last slide, this kind of quote that I have about longevity. When we asked folks who work in social justice movements about kind of what their greatest concern was or their greatest fear, and I think we're kind of looking for some like, oh, we unintended consequences of Giving Circle members trying to help out, but actually causing problems. That is not what came up. The greatest fear that folks expressed again and again is that folks would burn out, is that we as Giving Circles would want to do so much so fast that we would not be able to maintain the relationship. And folks really emphasized the importance of doing this work and helping this work over longer periods of time, and use different metaphors like a marathon, not a sprint, or a marriage, not a fling, but the desire to kind of have these relationships that can last for years and decades and can kind of build these movements over time rather than doing so much so fast that you cannot sustain it. So I will leave it there and kind of open it up for questions. I can kind of go to the chat and try and kind of catch up on some of the questions that are there. But if other folks have questions you want to kind of start with, please feel free.
Feel free to take yourselves off mute and just throw it out there. Allison, go ahead. Your hand's raised.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. This has been really interesting and I hope inspiring for folks who are working on these giving circles like myself. The long-term relationships comment at the end is really interesting because I think the model that I'm working on isn't going to necessarily be the same group of participants year after year. So the long-term relationship would be with, the managers of the circle. But that's then a lot for, if they're granting to 15 organizations, it's a lot for like one or two people to hold. So I'm curious if people discussed like what models of this look like and how that could happen.
Yeah, it was interesting because, these conversations, we kind of started as talking about, folks outside of movements or donors, and then started talking about Giving Circles and kind of the unique benefits and risks of Giving Circles. And a lot of the participants actually saw the Giving Circle vehicle, that one of its kind of big benefits is that it could be a vehicle for longevity, that instead of it being an individual donor where it's like, I am here, I help you out for a few years, oh, then I have a kid and I'm too busy and I can't kind of be involved anymore, that you can kind of have this organization and maybe the relationship gets passed on between that organization as people kind of become more or less engaged, but that could kind of help to build longevity.
Hi, this is Starita. Can I jump in or is somebody else put his hand?
Go for it.
First, I want to commend you. It's fabulous everything that you've said and that you're doing. And I'm looking forward for more research. The new 3Rs, our Giving Circle is 6th to 10th graders. And Gen Z has the mindset of inclusion and justice, but not necessarily their parents. And the challenge that we have is the generational divide and helping the parents. I mean, to the extent that we had to hire a therapist because, and I'm going to be clear and transparent, the BIPOC people were comfortable, but the white parents in the space was very uncomfortable talking about racial inequities. And so my question to you is, like, there's a difference between racial justice and social justice. And is there, later on down the road, in terms of the work that you are doing, is there a possibility that, you know, you can tease out a little bit more, particularly in terms of direction where our nation is going, to help giving circles get to that other side and understand the difference between social justice and racial justice?
That's a great question, and a great point. I mean, I'll just kind of share. I don't have a very good answer, but I'll share a couple things in response. One is that, you know, we did the individual interviews first, and talked to both kind of white folks and BIPOC folks. And it just became very clear from those individual conversations that the tone, the language, the flow of those conversations were very different for white people and people of color. And so we ended up kind of in the focus group phase, separating kind of white folks and BIPOC folks, so that those conversations could kind of flow more organically. The age piece is one that we didn't have the opportunity to kind of explore very much. It's kind of one of the areas where we didn't have as much diversity with the movement folks. You know, most of the folks that we talked to were kind of, you know, in the 25 to 40 range. I'm very interested in kind of what it looks like for, in particular, kind of the next generation of donors, the next generation of kind of movement builders, because as you raised, I think there's a much more kind of intuitive understanding of a lot of these topics. And yeah, that's definitely something we'd like to explore in the future.
Well, you can count on the new 3Rs. Our babies are 6th to 10th graders.
That's great.
Thank you.
Coming in with the good questions. Oh, go ahead, Emily.
So I really loved one of the points about people donating their networks as well as other ways they can donate. As my organization is shifting its focus and trying to be more of a social justice focused organization, we're trying to bring our Giving Circle members along with us. And they're actually somewhat interested. A lot of them are fairly interested in learning and growing, but how do we give them language when they're talking to their networks? Like, it's sort of a question I have.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, my experience is that that like there's a certain high that you get from like having those like epiphanies or aha moments as you kind of understand some of the frameworks for social justice and some of the kind of structural challenges that we're wrestling with and the opportunities. And I think that there's like a certain amount of equipping people with the language and the, kind of understanding and how do you talk about it. But in my experience, the much bigger threshold question is just then when you can light that fire under folks, when you can kind of have that conversation such that they are excited to be a part of a social justice giving circle or excited to kind of being working on social justice issues or approaching things around that space and then become excited to tell their friends about it. And that once you kind of light that fire, that that some of the language follows, that they'll kind of figure out how to talk about it once they learn. But also, I mean, I know a lot of you have got lots of other experiences on these questions, so I don't want to be the only one answering them if other folks have thoughts to share.
And I would say too, your members are more than welcome to join this space and like sharing these resources too, so that way folks can learn together. Maybe it's that you bring one of the recordings that you think your members really need to hear, and you sit with them and you watch it, and then collectively you run through the questions and just facilitate a dialogue. So that way folks are getting in the practice, right, of learning and growing and shifting their thoughts. Like, I love the way Seiji presented these 4 topics of questions, because those are 4 questions that you can then bring back to your giving circle or your collective giving space to say, let's unpack this. And maybe it's not that you come up even with answers. Like when I hear the question, what power are we willing to give up? There already is a baseline understanding that your members know what power they hold. Right. So maybe before you ask that question, you also have to do some of those conversations of like, what do we mean when we say power? And what does power look like in our giving? Just to throw that out there. But Guff, I think I saw you almost unmuting.
No, but I will.
Okay.
This is fascinating. Thank you so much. Some of the things, Kelsey, that you're bringing up, and Seiji, that you brought up, the question I have is around training. And I think a lot of times we think about, oh, well, here's what we can do for training, and here's this book, or here's this webinar, or whatever. I love the idea that you brought up, asking your community partners and movement leaders, what trainings do you recommend that we should go through to be just partners with you? And so I'm thinking a lot about that. Are there ideas that these movement builders have shared, like, hey, here are 4 or 5 things, or here are 2 things that are out there that would be helpful for us if you got trained up on?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the kind of, the specific like trainings materials that are available either online or in your areas probably vary. But I think that the like understanding the history of race and like what white supremacy means in the context of social justice movements and philanthropy was like one big bucket of ideas that I think there's lots of different trainings that approach it in different ways. But I think that was kind of one big area. I think that like class analysis was another, just kind of like coming into the space with like some understanding of like what most working folks are going through on a day-to-day basis. I think that's probably like yeah, kind of related to, humility probably more than like a specific training, but I think that was one that came up. And then just kind of some of the fluency in, I think both gender and sexuality. I think especially kind of when the folks were kind of thinking about older donors who like may not have kind of grown up with as developed language and understanding of identities and some of the kind of current and historical issues around them. But those are kind of the 3 that I would say, kind of gender and sexuality, race and class, and kind of shorthand. Yeah.
Hi, this is Susan. Thanks. This has been really interesting. One question I had is kind of, it's, working with our members in this sort of showing up outside of our grants giving process. And it's almost like I was, thinking it's almost like we as a giving circle need a little bit of like community organizing retools to sort of rethink how we can show up and get sort of both introduced to these organizations and kind of understanding how to show up. And I'm just wondering if that's something you came across with other giving circles in your discussions, or what some of the social justice organizations had to say about about ways that are helpful or not helpful around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the bulk of our conversation, honestly, is like what it means to show up and to show up more and show up better, and like which spaces are like appropriate, and how do you know and how do you communicate around that. I think my main takeaways was less about like the best right way to show up and more about like, kind of the idea of like get caught trying. Like if you show up too much, if you show up in the wrong space, if like, if you kind of overdo it at first, like that's a better mistake to make than to kind of hold back and like, oh, I don't know if I should go to this, or like, is this appropriate, or like, are we bringing too many people? And that those things can kind of be addressed as you go, but that the kind of force and engagement, once you have kind of the energy there, that it's easier to direct it. It's been, I'll just kind of speak from our Giving Circles experience, like it has been one of our challenges to, we've been going for like 8 years, like to try and kind of keep folks showing up beyond cutting a check, and to not make that kind of overwhelming for folks. One of the ways that we've kind of found some luck is just kind of setting very like, initial goals for all members of like choosing one organization and going to like 2 of their events in a year. It's like not a huge commitment, but I think that one of the things that you see is when you show up in some of these spaces, like it really has a huge impact, and makes it just kind of much more concrete, like what it means to like be in these spaces. It's like, oh, there's all these things that they need help with, and if I just come to this, I could like volunteer at this event, or like, oh, they don't have a table, I have a table, I could go grab it, like some of those things. So that's kind of like our bite-sized answer, is like just starting with those kind of entry points. But yeah, I don't know if other folks have other thoughts.
Seiji, I want to jump in and share a story from one of our project advisors. So as we were doing this research, we had additional project advisors who had experience in movements and were working in movements and were helping frame our questions. And I was sitting in a conversation with one of them, and she had just moved to a new community, and she was working with a local guy to develop this youth community space for youth to essentially explore and express themselves artistically while also learning about social justice. And as she was working with him, he had a baby, and because he worked remotely, he often was the one caring for the baby. And, there was one day where they were like setting up a stage, and she realized in that moment, oh man, what would be most useful for me to do right now is to hold his baby. And she had never held his baby before. She asked him, and he handed over the baby, and fundamentally their relationship just changed. And sorry, you can hear my dog. He's a little upset that I'm not giving him more treats, but the way she described it was, we had trusted each other before, but there was a layer of trust that needed to be built for me to hold the thing that was most precious to you. And so now I know for me, I find myself asking that question of, oh man, what trust needs to be built to hold the baby? And that's one of the things that I think a lot of Giving Circle members can start asking themselves, where it's like, how are we stepping into this trust and showing up? Any other questions? We still have a few more minutes left. Feel free to hop in, or even reactions. Anything is welcome. All right, y'all. Well, hearing none, I do just want to shout out again, we at the Social Justice Giving Circle Project are going to be doing a pilot. I dropped the link in the chat for the 2-pager. We're going to be, hopefully, our goal is to create a space for folks to practice being in movement. And if you have any questions or want to sit down with me for a one-on-one to learn more about that pilot, please feel free to sign up in the link that I dropped in the chat. I'll share it again, both the 2-pager and my link to set up a meeting. And with that, if we don't have any other questions, I'm down to release y'all with like what, 6 extra minutes, 7 extra minutes.
Thank you all very much.
Nice seeing you all. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.